This is a story that will challenge everything you think you know about survival, justice, and the lengths a human being will go to claim their freedom. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon, you won't want to miss stories like this. The year was 1847, deep in the heart of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in those shadows, a legend was about to be born. But legends aren't born in a single night. They are forged in the fires of suffering, shaped by years of careful observation, and strengthened by a will that refuses to break. His name was James, though in the plantation records he was listed simply as property, Juice 47, 28 years old, his back marked with scars from every failed escape attempt, his eyes burning with an intelligence his masters had tried desperately to crush. But James possessed something they could never chain, a mind sharper than any blade and a deep understanding of human nature. The Davenport plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of Virginia soil, its wealth built on the backs of more than 300 enslaved souls. Master Jonathan Davenport had a reputation across 3 counties as a particularly cruel owner, a man convinced that fear was the only language his property understood. He was wrong about many things. But he was absolutely right about one. James was planning something. That boy's got the devil in his eyes, Davenport often told his overseer, Marcus Crenshaw. He reads people like books, and I don't like what he's learning. Watch him close. He's planning something big. Davenport was right to be uneasy. James had been planning for over 2 years. But he wasn't planning a simple escape. He was planning a revolution of one. He had studied every white man on the plantation, their habits, their fears, their weaknesses. He knew which overseers drank too much, which guards fell asleep at their posts, which dogs responded to which commands. More importantly, he had studied the psychology of power, how men who had never truly been challenged would react when their authority was questioned. James had been born on the plantation, the son of a woman who died in childbirth and a father he never knew. He was raised by his grandmother, Old Sarah, who taught him early that survival meant more than staying alive. It meant staying invisible while your mind grew strong. Listen more than you speak, Old Sarah would whisper when he was a boy. Watch more than you act. The white folks think we're simple because they need us to be simple. But simple minds don't survive, child. Remember that. She died when James was 15, but not before giving him something invaluable, knowledge of the land. Old Sarah had been born free in the mountains of North Carolina before being captured and sold south. She knew every plant, every animal track, every shift in the wind. She taught James that the wilderness wasn't something to fear, it was something to understand. The forest don't care about the color of your skin, she told him. It only cares if you're smart enough to listen. For 13 years after her death, James listened. He learned which berries could keep you alive and which would poison you. He learned how to move silently through underbrush, how to mask his scent from tracking dogs, how to read the sky and predict weather days in advance. But most importantly, he learned patience. To the other enslaved people, James seemed quiet, obedient, unremarkable. To the overseers, he was a reliable worker who caused no trouble. To Master Davenport, he was proof that some slaves could be properly broken. They were all wrong. James was a student, and the plantation was his university. Every day, he gathered intelligence. He memorized patrol routes and shift changes. He noted which guards were alert and which were lazy. He studied the hunting dogs, their personalities, their weaknesses. He even befriended nearby poor white farmers, men who saw him as harmless and spoke openly in his presence about geography and local politics. But James's education went deeper than observation. He taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers and listening closely to conversations inside the big house. He understood the political tensions of the time, the growing divide between North and South, the economic machinery driving the slave system. He knew that his escape would not exist in isolation. It was part of something larger. And he planned accordingly. Over the years, James carefully built a network of contacts among enslaved people on neighboring plantations. Through quiet conversations at church gatherings and market days, he gathered knowledge about escape routes, safe houses, and the Underground Railroad. More importantly, he learned about the men who hunted runaways, their methods, their weaknesses, their psychology. Most slave catchers, he discovered, were driven by greed rather than ideology. Poor white men who saw hunting human beings as easy money. They relied on intimidation and numbers, not skill. Most had never faced organized resistance. And none of them had ever been hunted themselves. That realization shaped James's ultimate plan. He wouldn't just escape. He would turn the system of slave catching against itself. He would become so effective, so elusive, so terrifying, that the mere thought of tracking him would haunt men in their sleep. Opportunities to run had appeared many times over the years. But James had always waited. A simple escape meant likely recapture or death. What he was preparing for was far more ambitious. Far more dangerous. He was preparing to become a nightmare. He studied the terrain with the focus of a military cartographer. Every cave. Every hidden spring. Every game trail weaving through the mountains. He identified natural defensive positions and escape paths invisible to outsiders. He cached supplies across the mountains, food that wouldn't spoil, tools that could double as weapons, crude maps scratched onto bark and sealed in waterproof containers. His mental preparation was just as meticulous. He spent countless hours visualizing scenarios, planning responses to different forms of pursuit. He observed hunted animals and learned from them, how they doubled back, how they used terrain, how they vanished. He practiced moving through the forest at night, training his body to navigate by sound and touch when sight failed him. Then came the final catalyst. A sweltering August day in 1847. James was working in the tobacco fields when he saw something that turned years of planning into immediate resolve. A newly purchased enslaved woman named Mary collapsed from heat exhaustion. Instead of offering water or shade, the overseer began whipping her, screaming that she was pretending in order to avoid work. James watched as the others looked away, knowing that stepping in would only bring punishment upon themselves. He watched the whip tear open Mary's back. And in that moment, something inside him finally broke. That night, while the plantation slept, James made his final preparations. 4 years, he had cached supplies in hidden places throughout the mountains, food, tools, and weapons he had carefully crafted and concealed. He had studied maps stolen from the plantation house, committing every trail, every river, every settlement to memory for hundreds of miles in every direction. But more important than any tool or map was the work he had done inside his own mind. James understood that what he was about to do would change him forever. He would no longer be a victim. No longer property. He would become something else, something wild, something unstoppable. There would be no returning to the grim, familiar safety of captivity. He would either die free, or become the kind of presence that haunted the nightmares of every slave owner in Virginia. The opportunity came on a moonless night in October. A violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley, thunder cracking across the mountains, rain hammering the earth hard enough to drown out footsteps and wash away scent. While the other enslaved people huddled in their quarters, James slipped into the darkness like smoke. He moved through the forest with the silence of a predator. His bare feet found steady ground on wet leaves and slick stones. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. He flowed. Behind him, the plantation lights grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than a faint glow swallowed by the storm. Ahead of him stretched hundreds of miles of wilderness. And beyond that, maybe, just maybe, freedom. But James had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated just how far Jonathan Davenport was willing to go to make an example of him. By dawn, when Overseer Cranor discovered the empty quarters, Davenport was already calling together the largest manhunt the county had ever seen. 30 armed men. 2 packs of bloodhounds. And a bounty so large it made every poor white farmer in 5 counties reach for a rifle. $1,000, Davenport declared to the crowd gathered outside the county courthouse. $1,000 for the return of my property, dead or alive. And an additional $500 to anyone who brings me proof that he suffered before he died. It was more money than most of those men would see in 10 years. The hunt was on. But the hunters had no idea what they were truly chasing. The first week became a masterclass in psychological warfare, though none of the hunters realized they were students. James moved through the mountains like a ghost. But he wasn't just running. He was watching. From hidden ridgelines and thick patches of brush, he studied the hunting parties. He observed their tactics. Their personalities. Their weaknesses. He noted who naturally took command and who waited for orders. Who was brave. Who was simply greedy. And most importantly, who would break first when fear entered the equation. The bloodhounds were relentless. Their howls echoed through the valleys like something demonic. But James had prepared for them too. 4 months, he had trained his body with plants known to confuse scent. He knew which streams would wash away his trail and which would carry it farther downstream. He learned to move like local wildlife, zigzagging, doubling back, stepping on stones, confusing the dogs about what they were actually following. In those early days, James used tactics that would have impressed seasoned military strategists. He laid false trails that led hunting parties in exhausting circles. He lured mounted men into box canyons and swampy lowlands where horses became burdens instead of advantages. He even manipulated the dogs themselves, using carefully placed scents and sounds to trigger territorial instincts and set them snarling at one another. But the most important battlefield wasn't the forest. It was the minds of the men chasing him. James quickly realized that each hunter was driven by something different. Some wanted money. Some craved excitement. Others were fueled by pride, desperate to prove dominance over someone they believed inferior. Understanding those motivations would become his greatest weapon. On the fourth day, exhausted, surviving on rationed food and pure will, James made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden within a rocky outcrop deep in the mountains, he found the remnants of an old Cherokee camp. It had been abandoned decades earlier when the tribe was forced west during the Trail of Tears. But the camp wasn't empty of meaning. Carved into the stone were symbols left behind by others who had once hidden there, runaways who had come before him. A secret language of survival, passed down silently between the desperate and the brave. Among the carvings were detailed observations about hunting patterns. Warnings. Weaknesses. Fears. Intelligence gathered by fugitives who had fought this same battle. It was a gift. A map not just of land, but of the enemy. And the camp held something even more valuable. Weapons. Hidden in a carefully concealed cache were tomahawks, knives, and even an old musket with ammunition. The Cherokee who had once sheltered there had been warriors. They had prepared for last stands. Now their tools would serve a new warrior in a different kind of war. James stayed at the camp for 2 days. He rested. He resupplied. But more importantly, he learned. The Cherokee had left behind more than weapons. They left behind a philosophy. When facing a stronger force, you do not meet strength with strength. You meet it with patience. With cunning. You turn your enemy's advantages into liabilities. And that was when James fully understood something that shifted everything inside him. He wasn't just being hunted. He was being hunted by men who had never truly been hunted themselves. They knew how to track, but they had never felt eyes tracking them. They knew how to intimidate, but they had never felt real fear tightening their chests. They understood pursuit, but not vulnerability. James decided it was time they learned. Among the Cherokee markings, he also found encoded knowledge of local weather patterns and seasonal shifts. Generations of wisdom about hidden springs that never froze, caves that shielded against brutal storms, and the migration paths of animals that could mean the difference between starvation and survival. The Cherokee had endured overwhelming odds before. Their guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strikes, misdirection, psychological pressure, had allowed them to resist larger forces for years. James studied those methods carefully. Then he adapted them. He blended Cherokee strategy with his own deep understanding of the psychology of the men hunting him. The first lesson began on the 7th day. Thomas Garrett, a local farmer, had joined the hunt more for excitement than reward. He bragged constantly about his tracking skills and his supposed experience hunting dangerous game. In truth, the most dangerous thing he had ever hunted was a deer. But the other men in his group didn't know that. And soon, Thomas Garrett was about to learn what it felt like to become prey. Garrett thought he was close. The tracks ahead of him looked fresh, the kind that made a hunter's pulse quicken. He followed what he believed was James's trail into a narrow ravine, focused, confident. Then the earth vanished beneath his feet. He dropped 15 feet into a pit lined with sharpened stakes James had spent hours carving and positioning with deliberate care. But the trap wasn't meant to kill quickly. James hadn't built it for mercy. He had built it to teach. The pit was no crude hole in the ground. It was engineering. James had studied the soil composition and the natural drainage of the ravine to make sure the walls would hold firm until the exact moment they were triggered. He calculated the depth and angle with precision, deep enough to terrify, angled to wound, but designed so the victim would live long enough to understand what had happened. Most importantly, he chose the location carefully. It sat in a place where Garrett's screams would echo through the mountains and carry straight to his companions. And they did. 4 hours, Garrett's screams tore through the wilderness before they finally faded into silence. When the other hunters found the pit 2 days later, it wasn't just the quiet that unsettled them. It was what James had left behind. Garrett's rifle was gone. So were his ammunition and supplies. His boots had been removed and placed neatly at the edge of the pit, as if he had calmly decided to take a swim. And carved into a nearby tree were simple words, Lesson 1. The hunted is now the hunter. Class is in session. But that message wasn't the only thing James left behind. The pit itself told a story: careful engineering, proper drainage to prevent collapse, strategic placement for maximum psychological effect. Nearby, hidden almost invisibly, was a small cache of supplies, suggesting James had been preparing this specific trap for weeks. Fear began spreading through the hunting party like slow poison. These were men used to causing terror, not feeling it. They had joined the hunt expecting easy money, not a war of nerves against an opponent who seemed to anticipate every move before they made it. But the bounty was too large to walk away from. And Davenport's rage was too dangerous to disappoint. The plantation owner had made it clear, any man who abandoned the hunt would be branded a coward and would never work in the county again. 4 poor farmers barely surviving, that threat was a death sentence almost as certain as facing James in the wilderness. So the hunt continued. But everything had changed. The hunters now moved in larger groups. Their eyes never stopped scanning the trees. Their fingers hovered near their triggers. They jumped at every snapping twig, investigated every shifting shadow, and slept in shifts with guards posted around their camps. From the shadows, James watched. He studied their new habits. Their growing fear. Their rising desperation. He was no longer just a runaway slave. He had become something else, a force of nature. A reckoning 28 years in the making. The second lesson came 3 days later. William Hayes arrived from Georgia, hired by Davenport when the local hunters proved inadequate. Hayes was a professional slave catcher, experienced, cautious, and dangerous. He wasn't a desperate farmer chasing reward money. He understood that his prey was intelligent, and he adjusted his tactics accordingly. But Hayes had one weakness, pride. He could not accept that a mere slave could outwit a professional like him. That pride would destroy him. Hayes tracked James for 2 days before he found what looked like a hastily abandoned campsite. The fire was still warm. Food lay scattered as if dropped in panic. Fresh footprints led into the dense forest. It was exactly what an experienced tracker expected to see when closing in on desperate prey. It was also exactly what James wanted him to see. Hayes followed the trail confidently, each footprint clear, each broken branch convincing him he was gaining ground. He was so focused on the obvious signs that he never noticed the nearly invisible tripwire stretched across the path at ankle height. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. When Hayes's foot caught the wire, it released a carefully balanced log suspended above the trail. The massive pendulum swung down with crushing force. It didn't kill him immediately. James had calculated the weight and trajectory carefully. Hayes would live long enough to understand. Pinned beneath the log, legs shattered, rifle out of reach, Hayes lay helpless. Then James stepped from the shadows like death itself. But he didn't come to gloat. He didn't come to finish him quickly. He came to teach. "You're William Hayes," James said calmly. "From Savannah. You've been hunting my people for 15 years. You've caught 4 to 7 runaways and returned them to their masters. You've killed 12 who tried to resist." Shock washed over Hayes's face. How could a slave know so much about him? "I know because I make it my business to know," James continued evenly. "I know you have a wife named Catherine and 2 daughters. I know you live on Oglethorpe Street. I know you owe money to 3 creditors. And I know you're here because Davenport offered you $500 plus expenses to bring me back." The psychological blow was devastating. Hayes had built his life on the belief that enslaved people were incapable of deep thought, strategy, or intelligence. To realize that one of them had researched his life, studied him as thoroughly as he studied his targets, it shattered his worldview. By the end of the second week, the hunt had transformed completely. What started as a manhunt for a runaway slave had become something darker, a psychological war between a man with nothing left to lose and a group of men slowly realizing they had everything to lose. James had killed 3 hunters. 2 others were wounded so badly they would never hunt again. But the physical damage wasn't the worst of it. He had destroyed their confidence. They had signed up to chase a frightened fugitive through the woods. They had not signed up to be stalked by something that felt almost supernatural, an enemy who knew their weaknesses, predicted their movements, and exploited their fears. The remaining hunters began splintering into smaller factions. Suspicion poisoned their ranks. Each man felt watched. Each man wondered who would be next. Some wanted to abandon the hunt altogether. Davenport's threats kept them in the forest. Others wanted to burn the woods to flush James out. The local authorities refused. The timberland was too valuable. Meanwhile, James escalated. His tactics shifted from survival to calculated psychological warfare. He began leaving personal items from dead hunters where their companions would find them, a pocket watch placed deliberately on a stump, a distinctive button arranged on a rock. Nothing accidental. Everything intentional. The message was unmistakable. "I know who you are. I know where you've been. I know what happened to your friends. Then came the carvings. Throughout the forest, James etched messages into tree trunks. They weren't wild threats. They were detailed psychological profiles of individual hunters, descriptions of their fears, their weaknesses, their pasts, so precise it felt like witchcraft. In truth, it was observation, deduction, patience. But to men already unraveling, it felt supernatural. Marcus Crenshaw, Davenport's overseer, was the fourth to die. His death was personal. Crenshaw had whipped James countless times. He had broken him again and again. He had beaten Mary nearly to death for collapsing from exhaustion. He had supervised James for over a decade. If anyone understood James's habits and instincts, it was Crenshaw. That knowledge made him dangerous. It also made him a target. 4 days, James watched him, studying his new routines, his cautious movements, the way fear had begun to shape his behavior. The lesson was far from over. The overseer had grown paranoid. He never traveled alone anymore. He stayed in the center of his group at all times, constantly scanning the trees, checking over his shoulder, listening for sounds that might not be there. But James had learned something important. Paranoia could be just as dangerous as overconfidence. The trap he designed for Crenshaw was the most elaborate he had built so far. It demanded patience, precise timing, and a level of psychological insight that would have impressed a trained military strategist. First, James began planting false trails, carefully crafted misleading signs meant to pull the hunting party toward a specific location, a narrow valley with steep sides and very few escape routes. He made the signs obvious enough that Crenshaw would notice them, but subtle enough that the overseer would believe he was being clever in spotting them. Next came the harassment. James would briefly appear at the edge of a hunter's vision, just long enough to be seen, never long enough to be shot. He left personal belongings from the dead hunters in places where Crenshaw would inevitably find them. At night, he created sounds in the darkness, snapping branches, distant movement, shifting rocks, that kept the entire party tense and sleepless. But perhaps his most effective tactic was psychological manipulation. James deliberately left signs suggesting he was slipping back into old habits, making the same kinds of mistakes he had made during earlier escape attempts. To Crenshaw, it looked like the pressure was finally breaking him. It seemed as if James was reverting to familiar but flawed tactics. That illusion pushed Crenshaw toward desperation. The overseer became convinced that the only way to end the hunt was to confront James directly, man to man. That was exactly the mindset James had been cultivating. At the same time, James quietly fueled the growing tension inside the hunting party. He planted evidence hinting that some hunters were considering abandoning the search. He left subtle clues suggesting that others might try to eliminate their competition and claim the bounty alone. The result was mistrust. The hunters began watching each other as closely as they watched the forest. Suspicion turned allies into threats. The strain grew unbearable for some. A few swore they saw James where he couldn't possibly be. Others claimed they heard his voice carried on the wind. Some found carved messages that vanished when they looked again. Reality and nightmare began to blur. James exploited that confusion without mercy. The confrontation finally came on a fog-choked morning in the very valley James had chosen. Crenshaw, accompanied by 5 hunters, followed what appeared to be a fresh trail. The footprints led them into a natural amphitheater, steep rocky walls rising around them, the mist clinging to the stone like a curtain. "I know you're here, boy," Crenshaw shouted into the fog. "Come out and face me like a man. You think you're so smart, but you're still just a slave. You're still my property." The answer did not come in words. It came from the valley itself. Carefully placed charges, black powder stolen from the hunters' own supplies, detonated along the ridges. Sections of rock crashed down, sealing the exits and trapping the hunting party inside a natural prison. Dust filled the air. Echoes rolled through the stone walls. And when the smoke cleared, James appeared on a ledge above them, silhouetted against the gray sky like something sent for judgment. "You're right about one thing, Crenshaw," James called down. "I am still the boy you used to whip. I remember every lash. Every humiliation. Every moment you tried to make me feel less than human." He paused. "But you're wrong about something else. I'm not your property anymore. I'm your judgment." What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. James had spent days preparing the valley, transforming it into a maze of traps, ambush points, and kill zones. He eliminated the hunters one by one, often using their own weapons against them. Their training became their weakness. The valley itself had been engineered into a sophisticated killing ground. James had studied the acoustics, learning how sound would travel between the walls, how echoes could mislead and disorient. He had prepared multiple firing positions, each offering clear sight lines and concealed escape routes. Sections of the valley floor had been rigged to collapse under weight, creating instant pit traps that could be triggered when needed. He had planned for every possible reaction. If they tried to climb the walls, rock slides waited above them. If they returned fire, mirrors and reflective surfaces distorted their aim. If they attempted to surrender, he was ready for that too, though he had no intention of accepting it. Crenshaw was the last to fall. James made certain he understood why. As the overseer lay bleeding from a dozen wounds, James knelt beside him and spoke calmly, the same steady tone he had used with Hayes. "Do you remember Mary?" James asked. "The girl you beat for collapsing in the heat. She died 3 days after I escaped. The wounds you gave her became infected. She died in agony." He let that settle. "Do you remember old Sarah? My grandmother. You sold her medicine to buy whiskey. She died coughing up blood because she couldn't afford the treatment she needed." James continued, naming cruelty after cruelty, each memory a weight pressing down on Crenshaw's final moments. By the time the overseer died, he understood something. This was not random violence. This was justice, brutal, personal, deliberate. But James was not finished. He took Crenshaw's whip, the same whip that had scarred his back, and used it to hang the overseer's body from a tree where the remaining hunters would find it. Carved into the trunk beneath the body were the words, "The wages of cruelty are paid in full." News of Crenshaw's death spread through the county like wildfire. The man who had terrorized enslaved people for 20 years was dead, killed by one of his own victims in a display of tactical brilliance so remarkable that even military minds would have studied it. Yet the psychological impact was even greater. For the first time in the history of Virginia slavery, the enslaved had a hero, someone who had not only escaped but had turned the tables in the most dramatic way imaginable. Across plantations, James's name was whispered with reverence. He had done what others only dreamed of. He had made the masters afraid. And in the mountains, the hunt continued. But now the hunters were the ones being hunted. As winter approached, the pursuit of James evolved into something far larger than a manhunt. It became a symbol of a deeper conflict at the heart of American society, the struggle between those who would enslave and those who would be free. Jonathan Davenport, consumed by rage, pride, and fear, raised the bounty to $2,000. He brought in professional slave catchers from as far away as New Orleans and Charleston. These were not struggling farmers chasing reward money. They were not local toughs looking to impress their neighbors. These were professionals. Men who made their living hunting human beings. They understood their prey was dangerous, and they acted accordingly. The new hunting party was led by Jeremiah Stone, a notorious slave catcher whose brutality was legendary even within his brutal profession. Stone had hunted runaways for 25 years and had never failed to retrieve his quarry, dead or alive. He was methodical, patient, utterly ruthless.
"This isn't about the money anymore," Stone told his team of 12 seasoned hunters. "This is about proving that no slave, no matter how clever, can defeat the natural order. If we let this boy get away with what he's done, every plantation from here to Georgia will be dealing with copycat killers within a year." He was right to worry. James's story had spread far beyond Virginia. On plantations across the South, enslaved people whispered his name in the dark and imagined what freedom might look like if they dared to fight for it. Several escape attempts were already being blamed on James. Plantation owners were growing nervous, then fearful, then openly paranoid. The idea of organized resistance, once dismissed as impossible, was now whispered about in tense meetings behind closed doors. The psychological shock of James's campaign was spreading like wildfire through enslaved communities across the South. In the slave quarters, new songs began to emerge. They sounded like spirituals, filled with coded metaphors and layered symbols, but they told James's story. His victories. His defiance. His survival. Children began playing games that reenacted his triumphs over the hunters. And most dangerous of all for the plantation system, enslaved men and women began organizing their own escape attempts. They borrowed tactics from the stories of James's exploits: misdirection, patience, psychological manipulation. Hope had taken root. But Jeremiah Stone made one critical mistake in reading the situation. He still saw James as a slave. Clever. Dangerous. Resourceful, perhaps. But ultimately limited by his birth, his lack of formal education, his years in bondage. Stone could not imagine that a man born into chains might evolve beyond the simple categories of master and slave. But James had done exactly that. In the months since his escape, he had become something entirely new. Not just a fugitive. Not merely a rebel. He had become a force of nature. A living embodiment of the rage, grief, and determination of an entire people. He studied his enemies so thoroughly that he understood them better than they understood themselves. He no longer thought only in terms of tactics, how to survive the next encounter, but in strategy, how to win the entire war. In the weeks before Stone's arrival, James prepared for what he knew would be the final confrontation. He established multiple base camps throughout the mountains. Each one was stocked with weapons, supplies, and intelligence gathered from earlier encounters. He mapped every trail, every stream, every cave, every narrow crevice that could provide shelter or advantage. But he was thinking beyond himself now. James began leaving hidden caches of supplies and weapons in places where other runaways might stumble upon them. Inside concealed caves, he carved detailed maps and instructions into the walls, guides for future fugitives who might follow his path. Even if he died, the knowledge would survive. The final clash was inevitable. James chose the time and place with the same precision he applied to everything else. The location was a box canyon deep in the mountains, a place that, at first glance, looked like the perfect trap for a desperate fugitive. It had only one visible entrance. Steep walls rose on three sides. There appeared to be no escape. To Stone and his men, it looked ideal. They were wrong. James had spent weeks transforming that canyon from a natural prison into a carefully engineered battlefield. He studied the terrain like a military engineer, identifying strengths, eliminating weaknesses. He cached weapons and supplies in hidden pockets throughout the canyon. Most importantly, he prepared multiple escape routes that were invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The canyon itself became a masterpiece of defensive design. James found weak points in the rock walls and carefully placed explosive charges that could collapse key sections on command. He dug concealed firing positions that provided clear lines of sight while remaining invisible from below. He even diverted a small stream to ensure a steady water supply if the fight turned into a prolonged siege. But the canyon was not only a physical trap. It was psychological warfare. James arranged animal bones in deliberate patterns near the entrance, grim, unsettling designs that would unsettle anyone stepping inside. He carved messages into the rock faces, words that the morning sun would illuminate, messages aimed directly at the fears and guilt of his pursuers. He also created false escape routes, paths that looked like exits but were actually elaborate traps. These routes funneled anyone who followed them into predetermined kill zones. James understood how professional hunters like Stone thought. He knew they would expect him to have an escape plan. So he gave them several. All of them deadly. Then came his boldest move yet. James allowed Stone's men to capture another runaway, a young man named David, who had escaped from a plantation 50 miles to the south. But instead of immediately rescuing him, James used David as bait. He let Stone believe he was closing in on his true target. The psychological war began at once. James appeared at the edges of the hunting party's vision, always just beyond rifle range, always leading them deeper toward the canyon. He left clear tracks, obvious signs of passage, small hints of haste and carelessness. "He's getting sloppy," Stone told his 12 men as they followed the trail. 3 months of running have finally shaken him. He's making mistakes now, the kind that get men killed. Stone was half right. James was making mistakes. But they were deliberate mistakes, carefully calculated errors meant to draw the hunters into a position where their numbers and firepower would work against them. The hunters entered the canyon on a cold February morning. Winter had locked the mountains in ice and snow. The forest glittered like glass, branches heavy with frost. Inside the canyon, they found what appeared to be James's camp, a small fire still smoldering, scattered supplies, signs of hurried departure. Confident their prey was cornered, they spread out to search. Stone positioned his men with military precision. He covered every visible escape route. He established overlapping fields of fire. He prepared for a siege if necessary. He had studied the failures of the previous hunting parties and intended to repeat none of them. He was taking no chances. But James had learned too. And his lessons had been harsher and more thorough. The first explosion shattered the morning silence. A section of the canyon wall collapsed, not randomly, not chaotically. James had calculated the blast with precision. The falling rock sealed the main entrance, cutting off Stone's line of retreat. At the same time, James's hidden escape routes remained untouched. The hunters were no longer advancing into a trap. They were sealed inside it. The falling rocks crushed 2 of Stone's men instantly. The rest were trapped inside the canyon, with the very man they had come to hunt. Then came the second explosion. It triggered a carefully calculated avalanche. Snow and debris thundered down the canyon walls, burying 3 more hunters and filling the air with blinding white chaos. The world became a storm of ice, stone, and echoing screams. And in that confusion, James moved. He moved through the remaining hunters like something unstoppable, an avenging spirit born from the mountains themselves. He used weapons taken from previous victims. He turned their own tactics against them. Every maneuver they had perfected over years of hunting was now being used to destroy them. But this was not just a fight. It was a reckoning. As James fought his way through Stone's men, he spoke to each of them. He made sure they understood why they were dying. "You're Benjamin Crawford from Alabama," he said as he drove a knife between one man's ribs. "You've been hunting my people for 8 years. You killed a pregnant woman in Mississippi because she tried to protect her unborn child." To another, as he crushed the man's skull with the butt of a stolen rifle, he said, "You're Samuel Morrison from South Carolina. You specialize in tracking children. You've separated more families than yellow fever." Each death was personal. Each killing was a sentence carried out with surgical precision. James had studied these men the way a prosecutor studies defendants before trial. And now he was delivering verdicts no courtroom would ever pronounce. When the snow finally settled and the echoes faded, only Jeremiah Stone remained alive. And he remained alive because James wanted him to. Stone lay pinned beneath a fallen tree. His legs were crushed. His rifle was out of reach. He stared up at the man who had destroyed his entire team. James stood over him, blood and snow streaked across his body, weapons taken from the dead hanging at his side. "Tell them," James said, his voice heavy with generations of suffering. "Tell them the slave they hunted no longer exists. Tell them something else has taken his place. Something that remembers every whip, every chain, every moment of stolen dignity. Tell them the mountains have eyes now, and they're watching." He knelt down, his face inches from Stone's. "Tell them James is dead. The property they owned. The boy they whipped. The man they hunted. He's gone. What's taken his place is something they built with their own cruelty. Tell them every plantation, every auction block, every slave ship has been building toward this moment. Tell them the reckoning has begun." Stone tried to speak, to threaten, to bargain, to beg, but James silenced him with a small gesture. "You don't get to talk anymore," James said quietly. "For 25 years, you've been the one with the power. The one with the weapons. The one who decided who lived and who died. Now it's my turn." James stood and began walking away. He left Stone alive, but broken. Trapped beneath the tree. Alone in the cold canyon with no hope of rescue. At the edge of the canyon, James stopped and looked back one last time. "When they find you, if they find you, tell them this," he called out. "The age of easy hunting is over. Tell them somewhere in these mountains there's a man who knows their names, their faces, their crimes. Tell them the hunted has become the hunter. And the hunt will never end." Stone survived for 3 days. Exposure and his injuries finally claimed him. Weeks later, a rescue party found his body. They also found a message carved into the tree that had pinned him, the last lesson. There is no escape from justice, only a delay in its delivery. James was never seen again. For decades afterward, slave catchers refused to enter certain areas of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They whispered about a ghost in the woods, a spirit of vengeance that protected runaways and punished those who tried to drag them back into bondage. Some believed James died in those mountains, free at last, but alone. Others claimed he made it north. that he reached Canada or the Free States and lived out his days quietly while his legend grew larger with every retelling. Still others believed he remained in the mountains, a guardian for fugitives, a nightmare for hunters. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps James became exactly what he needed to become. Not just a man who escaped slavery, but a symbol of what happens when the oppressed refuse to remain victims. When intelligence and relentless determination turn desperation into deadly purpose. His story spread through enslaved communities across the South, shared in whispers around cabin fires, passed from one generation to the next as both inspiration and warning. It reminded people that freedom always carried a cost, and that sometimes the only way to break chains was to reshape them into weapons. In the years that followed, successful slave escapes in Virginia increased sharply. Plantation owners found themselves facing fugitives who used new strategies, new tactics, new ways of thinking about the relationship between hunter and hunted. Some believed James was still alive, secretly training others. Others thought it was simply the power of his example. The truth was likely both. James had proven that intelligence, preparation, and absolute determination could overcome odds that seemed impossible. He had shown that the system of master and slave was not natural or eternal, but fragile and artificial. Most importantly, he demonstrated that those who profited from human suffering were not beyond consequence. The mountains still stand. And somewhere in their shadows, the legend of James still whispers its message. No chain is strong enough to hold a mind determined to be free. No hunter is safe when the hunted decides to fight back. His story reminds us that throughout history, the human spirit has found ways to resist even the most brutal oppression, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the refusal to accept it as inevitable. In a world where human beings were treated as property, James chose to become something property could never be. Free. Terrifyingly free. And in doing so, he lit a flame that burned in the hearts of the oppressed for generations, a flame no violence or intimidation could extinguish. The legacy of James lives on, not only in the mountains where he made his stand, but in every person who refuses injustice, who chooses resistance over submission, who understands that freedom is not a gift to be granted but a right to be claimed. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the odds seem impossible, the human spirit can rise. And sometimes, just sometimes, it can win. What did you think of James's incredible story of survival and vengeance? This tale reminds us that throughout history, people have found ways to resist even the harshest oppression. James's story shows how intelligence, determination, and a refusal to accept injustice can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories that will leave you speechless. And tell me in the comments, do you believe James was a hero fighting for justice, or did his methods go too far? Your answer might reveal more about your own values than you expect. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful historical stories that challenge the way we think about justice, freedom, and the cost of resistance. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or places is purely coincidental and should not be taken as factual representation. While the story draws inspiration from the historical realities of slavery and resistance in 19th century America, the characters, specific events, and narrative details are entirely fictional and created for dramatic purposes. The story is intended to honor the memory of those who suffered under slavery and those who fought for freedom. But it is not a historical account of actual events.